The issue for people is, well, in the New Testament, it no longer thinks of the Jewish people as Israel, they will say, and that in the New Testament, the true Israel, which they would say are those Jews or Gentiles who follow Jesus, that they are now the chosen people. But I think it's really important for us to take a look at Scripture and see what the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament about whether or not Jewish people are still chosen. Well, clearly, when we read the Hebrew Bible, it teaches that the Jewish people are the people whom God chose. You can see that in the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, in Genesis chapter 15, Genesis 17, and then the same covenantal promises of God promising a land and an offspring and blessing to Abraham is passed on to Isaac and to Jacob. But the issue for people is, well, in the New Testament, it no longer thinks of the Jewish people as Israel, they will say, and that in the New Testament, the true Israel, which they would say are those Jews or Gentiles who follow Jesus, that they are now the chosen people. But I think it's really important for us to take a look at Scripture and see what the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament about whether or not Jewish people are still chosen. So I would always go to the book of Romans, and in Romans chapter 11, it's a great place to start about the question of chosenness. Because in verse 28 of Romans 11, it says, regarding the gospel, they are enemies for your advantage. Now, I want to be really clear that they there is Israel, and they are not enemies of God, like many people say. It says in this text that they are opposed to the gospel. Not all Jewish people, but for the most part, Jewish leadership have led first century Jewish people away from faith in Jesus into opposition to the gospel. And that has remained so. I mean, I'm a Jewish person who believes in Jesus, as was Paul. But for the most part, Jewish people don't believe. And Paul says to the Romans, this is for your advantage. What does he mean by that? The advantage is that because Jewish people were opposed to the gospel, the good news went forth to the whole world. It's what Romans 11:11, just in the previous paragraph, talked about. It says that they have not stumbled in order to fall. Absolutely not. On the contrary, by their stumbling, by their rejection of the Messiah Jesus, salvation has come to the Gentiles, that the gospel now went forth. And that's why Paul says their opposition to the gospel is for your advantage. But so I want to be really clear. He's talking about Jewish people who don't believe in Yeshua, in Jesus. This is important to see. And it's to the advantage of the Romans. But then he says, but regarding election, now election's kind of a big word, but it means something really simple. I wish all English translation would just translate it for what it means in English and common day speech, common parlance that we use, which is, but regarding chosenness, they are loved because of the patriarchs. And so Paul is saying they may be opposed to the gospel. That's good for you, Romans. But, and this is important, they remain the chosen people, and they are loved by God because of what God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what I had just talked about from the Old Testament. So Paul sees no distinction between that chosenness from the Old Testament, the national people, the people that God chose, the Jewish people, and now even though they don't believe. And I think this is crucial because it says, since God's gracious gifts and calling are irrevocable. God gave many gifts to the Jewish people and gave them a calling to be the light to the nations, to be the nation that would represent God to the world. And that is irrevocable. Now, if you want to know what gifts God gave Israel, it's really kind of interesting because Paul opens this section in Romans 9 through 11, these three chapters, And he talks about his great grief over Jewish unbelief and how he could wish himself accursed, that he would be separated from the Messiah if only his people would believe. That's Romans 9, 1-3. And then this is what he says about these people who are not yet followers of Jesus. These are not people who believe in Yeshua. These Jewish people, he says, they are Israelites, and to them belong. Now, it's interesting. There's only one verb here that governs all these things that are to the Jewish people. And even Thomas Schreiner, a great New Testament scholar, says that these things belonged and continue to belong to the Jewish people, because these are the gifts that God gave them. To them belong the adoption. The adoption has to be that God chose Israel, my son, Exodus chapter 4, my firstborn. The glory, the presence of God gathered and led the Jewish people through the wilderness. The covenants, that's the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the new covenant, and even the Mosaic covenant. All these belong to the Jewish people. The giving of the law, the Sinai covenant, the temple service, the priests and Levites are still called, when there's a temple, to serve God there. This is a gift that he gave them. And the promises, all the promises, like the promise of a land, the promise of a Messiah, all those promises belong to the Jewish people. Then it says the ancestors or the patriarchs are theirs. And from them, by physical descent, came the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, who is God over all, praised forever. When we ask, are Jewish people still chosen? Paul would give a resounding yes. How about Jewish people who don't believe in Jesus? That's who Paul is talking about. They are chosen by God, beloved by God. The promises will not be broken. God's going to keep his word.